There is a state in the middle of America that most people associate with Mount Rushmore, with the Badlands, and with a lot of empty space between those two things. South Dakota, the Mount Rushmore state. Population 900,000. The Missouri River cuts it in half. The east is flat farmland, the west is ranch country and Black Hills, and the land of the Lakota Sioux. And somewhere in the southeastern corner, in the small German-Russian immigrant towns along the old railroad line, there is a food that most Americans have never heard of and that South Dakotans have been eating since before their state existed. South Dakota, where the official state snack is older than the state, and nobody outside South Dakota has heard of it. 10 dishes this state doesn't just make, it owns. The story begins with Catherine the Great. In 1763, Catherine, a German-born empress who had come to power in Russia, issued a manifesto inviting Germans to settle the empty grasslands of the Russian Empire along the Black Sea. Thousands of Germans came, Mennonites, Lutherans, Hutterites, fleeing religious persecution in Central Europe. They built their communities on the Russian steppe. They learned to cook from their neighbors, including the Crimean Tatars, who had been cooking shashlik for centuries, meat cubed small, skewered on metal rods, grilled over open fire. For over 100 years, the German communities of Russia maintained their traditions, including the shashlik. Then, in the 1870s, Russia began revoking the privileges that had protected them: military exemptions, cultural autonomy, the right to speak German. By 1872, many began leaving for America. By 1872, facing discrimination against their culture in Russia, many sought new lives in America and arrived in Freeman, South Dakota, due to its proximity to the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway Company line. Oral history often gives Johann Hullwarth, 1849 to 1919, credit for introducing chislick to the area. Hullwarth was part of the Lutheran Heilbronn congregation southwest of Freeman when he came to Dakota Territory from the Crimea in the 1870s. Then came the prairie problem. The German immigrants were resourceful folks, and the answer was obvious. They would not grill it. They would fry it in the lard of the sheep they butchered. In Russia, shashlik meat was often marinated for hours in onions and other seasonings before being threaded onto a metal skewer. It was served with flatbread. In America, the Germans from Russia came to substitute garlic salt for the marinade, thin wooden skewers for metal, and saltine crackers for flatbread. The name transformed too. It is not hard to imagine how a person with a thick German brogue might have pronounced shashlik or shishlik back in the late 1800s, and how, over the decades that followed, others Americanized both the spelling and pronunciation to become chislick. Chislick, skewered cubes of deep-fried lamb or beef, is a rugged regional culinary tradition. For decades, a mainstay at cafes, bars, fairs, and celebrations, it historically has been enhanced only by salt or garlic salt and served with saltines. South Dakota officially designated chislick as the official state nosh in 2018. The town of Freeman, South Dakota, population 1,300, is considered the chislick capital of America. The South Dakota Chislick Festival is held there annually. Before the German-Russian immigrants arrived, before the railroad, before South Dakota was South Dakota. The Lakota Sioux people were making wajapi. Wajapi is a traditional Lakota berry sauce. Choke cherries, wild plums, buffalo berries, or other native berries, cooked down with water and thickened with dried prairie turnip flour, or, in modern versions, cornstarch. The result is a thick, sweet tart sauce the consistency of jam, served warm over fry bread tacos, over venison, or eaten on its own. The berries used in wajapi were not cultivated. They were gathered from the wild, from the choke cherry trees along creek banks, from the buffalo berry bushes on hillsides, from the wild plum thickets that still grow across the Great Plains. The gathering of berries was a summer activity, a community activity. Berries were dried for winter use, pounded into pemmican with dried bison meat and fat, or cooked down into wajapi for immediate consumption. Choke cherries, the small, intensely flavored wild cherry of the northern Great Plains, are the traditional wajapi berry. They are deeply tart when raw, with a slight bitterness from the pits. Cooked with sugar or honey, they become complex and richly flavored, tasting of something specifically of the plains that cultivated cherries cannot match. Wajapi is served at powwows, at tribal gatherings, at the restaurants and cultural events of South Dakota's 9 tribal nations. In 1989, South Dakota designated kuchen as the official state dessert. The word is German for cake. The specific kuchen of South Dakota is not any German cake. It is a specific yeasted pastry that the German-Russian immigrants brought to the prairie and adapted to what was available. A South Dakota kuchen is a soft, slightly sweet yeasted dough pressed into a pan and topped with a custard filling, eggs, cream, sugar, and vanilla, and fruit, peaches, apricots, plums, or prunes pressed into the custard before baking. The result is a flat, open-faced pastry that is part cake, part custard tart, part fruit pie, dense and rich and specifically of the German immigrant kitchen. The kuchen tradition in South Dakota runs through the German-Russian communities of the Southeast, the same communities that brought chislick. At church potlucks, at community suppers, at harvest celebrations, the kuchen appears on the table alongside the chislick. The two foods arrived in South Dakota from the same place, with the same people, on the same railroad trains in the 1870s. The South Dakota kuchen is available at German-Russian heritage festivals across the state and at bakeries in communities like Freeman, Menno, and Eureka. Fry bread in South Dakota is the same fry bread as everywhere in Indian country. White flour, baking powder, salt, water, deep fried in oil. But in South Dakota, it carries the specific weight of the Lakota people's history with forced removal and commodity foods. When the U.S. government confined the Lakota to reservations in the late 19th century, it provided commodity rations, white flour, lard, sugar, canned goods. The Lakota had been a bison-hunting people whose diet was built around bison, wild game, wild berries, and prairie plants. None of those foods were available in the commodity rations. Fry bread was developed from what was given. The Lakota taco, fry bread topped with seasoned ground beef or bison, pinto beans, shredded cheddar, lettuce, tomato, sour cream, and salsa, is the modern expression of that adaptation. It is served at every powwow, at every tribal fair, at roadside stands throughout the reservation. It is simultaneously a symbol of survival and a reminder of the displacement that created it. South Dakota has more bison than any other state in the continental United States. Custer State Park in the Black Hills maintains a herd of approximately 1,500 bison, one of the largest free-roaming bison herds in the world. The Tatanka herd at Badlands National Park. The private ranches of western South Dakota that have been raising bison commercially since the conservation movement of the 1980s and 1990s brought the species back from near extinction. The American bison was the foundation of the Plains Indian food economy for thousands of years. The Lakota people and other Plains nations built their entire food system around the bison: the meat, the fat, the organs, the bones for marrow, the tongue, the hide for storage and shelter. The near extinction of the bison in the 19th century, through commercial hunting and deliberate U.S. government policy intended to undermine Plains Indian food sovereignty, was one of the defining ecological and humanitarian catastrophes of American history. The bison burger served at restaurants in the Black Hills and at Custer State Park is leaner than beef, with a slightly sweeter, more complex flavor. Bison steaks, bison stew. South Dakota produces more pheasants than any other state in America. The ring-necked pheasant, not a native bird, introduced from China in the 1880s, found in the tall grass prairies and agricultural fields of eastern South Dakota, a habitat so suitable that the state's pheasant population has made it the premier pheasant hunting destination in the world. Pheasant season in South Dakota, opening in mid-October, draws hunters from across the country and internationally. The lodges in small towns of eastern South Dakota fill with hunters every October. The restaurants serve pheasant in every form: roasted, braised, made into soup, stuffed into dumplings. Pheasant breast served with wild rice and a fruit sauce, chokecherry or buffalo berry, is the South Dakota fine dining expression of the state's most abundant game bird. Pheasant is eaten in South Dakota the way walleye is eaten in Minnesota, with the comfortable familiarity of a food that is part of the seasonal rhythm of the state. The Missouri River and the glacial lakes of eastern South Dakota, the bodies of water that cover a significant portion of the state's eastern half, produce walleye in quantities that make South Dakota one of the premier walleye fishing states in America. Walleye is the official state fish of South Dakota. It is the fish of the Missouri River system, a freshwater predator with white, flaky, mild-flavored meat that is the definitive freshwater fish of the northern plains. Fried walleye, dredged in seasoned cornmeal or flour, pan-fried in butter, is the Friday night fish in South Dakota, The way fried catfish is the Friday night fish in Mississippi. The German-Russian community of South Dakota brought more than chislick and kuchen from the steppes of Russia. Fleischkuechle, the name means meat cake in German, is a deep-fried meat pastry, a thin dough wrapped around a filling of seasoned ground beef and onion, sealed, and dropped in hot oil until the outside is golden and the filling is cooked through. It is a turnover, essentially, but with the specific spice profile of the German-Russian kitchen and the specific technique of the prairie cook who had oil for frying and nothing else. Fleischkuechle appears at the same festivals, church suppers, and community events where chislick and kuchen appear. It is the main course to chislick's appetizer and kuchen's dessert, the full meal of the German-Russian prairie community in 3 dishes. Outside of German-Russian communities in South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas, Fleischkuechle is essentially unknown. The chokecherry is the tree of the Black Hills, a small wild cherry that grows along every creek and river in the region, produces intensely flavored small dark fruits, and has been the foundation of a South Dakota food tradition since the Lakota were gathering it for pemmican and wojapi long before European contact. South Dakota chokecherry products, syrup, jam, wine, jelly, are sold at every roadside stand, every fruit market, and every gift shop in the Black Hills. The chokecherry syrup poured over pancakes at a Black Hills diner is the most specifically South Dakota breakfast experience. The same berry that the Lakota processed for winter food, now on a griddle cake in a tourist town. The chokecherry wine produced by South Dakota wineries, particularly in the Black Hills wine region, is tart, deeply colored, and specific to the northern plains in a way that grape wine grown in more temperate climates cannot approximate. South Dakota's food is the food of collision, of the Lakota, who have been here since time before memory, of the German-Russian immigrants who arrived in the 1870s with their chislick and their kuchen, of the ranchers and farmers who followed, of the hunters who come every October for the pheasants. The chislick that Catherine the Great's immigration policy set in motion 300 years ago is now the official state snack of a state Catherine the Great never knew existed. The wojapi that the Lakota made from wild chokecherries is now served at restaurants in Rapid City alongside the German kuchen from the same prairie town. The bison that nearly went extinct through deliberate government policy is now on the tourist menu in Custer State Park. Not every state's official snack has a history that runs from the Crimean Tatars, through Catherine the Great's immigration policy, through a German carpenter with no access to firewood. Not every state serves 2 foods, chislick and wojapi, that represent 2 completely different civilizations that ended up in the same place and found different ways to feed themselves from what the prairie provided.